Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it is your first time here. My name is Jess. Today is going to be my January reading wrap up, and all in all I think I had a really solid start to my reading year. I read some absolutely fantastic books. I read some that I didn't like so much, but on the whole a really good start. So without further ado, let's jump in and start talking about the book. So the first book that I read was actually, confusingly, my book club's December pick, because our live discussion is the last Sunday of the month, and December is obviously a month of just chaos because of Christmas and New Year. We actually pushed the discussion to the start of January, so I didn't actually read it until the first week, and that was Once Upon a Wardrobe by Patty Callahan. I absolutely adored this book. This is historical fiction. It's about Megs Devonshire and her brother George, and unfortunately George has a heart condition, which means that he will probably pass away at a very young age, and George sets Megs the task of finding out the inspiration behind the much beloved children's classic The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Megs is a student at Oxford University, where C.S. Lewis was also a professor, and so Megs strikes up a friendship with Mr. Lewis, and he begins to tell her stories of his childhood, and you can pick through and see where some of the inspiration for the characters and the setting of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe might have come from. This is a book which is obviously rooted in a lot of fact. I believe the author wrote another book about C.S. Lewis's wife, but it is so much more than that. It is whimsical and magical. It absolutely captures the essence of what it means to be a reader and why people love getting lost in the whimsy and the magic of stories. It's just absolutely stunning. I actually listened to this on audiobook because getting a physical copy proved to be incredibly difficult, but you can see where I've tabbed it there. As soon as my physical copy arrived, I went back through and highlighted and tabbed so many sections because there were just so many quotes in here to love, and it is definitely a book that I will go back and reread. And that isn't something that I say often about this type of book. I'm more likely to reread fantasy books that are part of a bigger series. It's very rare that I will go back and reread a historical fiction book, but I will 100% be returning to this book. I thought it was fantastic. It's very much about C.S. Lewis and his life, but it's also about Meg's understanding and capturing the joy of stories, and a little bit of discovering who she is as well, in and amongst all of the different things that are going on in her life. So yes, highly recommend. Gave it 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. Then I picked up Transcendent Kingdom by Jess. This is a contemporary about Gifty, a neuroscientist who is trying to make sense of her world. We learn very early on that something really tragic happened to Gifty's brother, and also that her father left when she was at quite a young age, and that her mother suffers with depression. And this really is Gifty's story of her trying to make sense of her world when some quite sad and shocking things have happened to her. Gifty was raised by a guardian mother in a very religious home, and this story is very much Gifty trying to make sense of and marry up the religious teachings that she received as a child versus the scientific world that she now finds herself in, and her decision to become a neuroscientist is very much rooted in what happened to her brother and what is happening to her family. And again, I just absolutely loved this. I thought that Gifty's voice was so strong. I thought the story was incredibly relatable. There were moments of dark humour sprinkled in and amongst really quite tragic circumstances, and Gifty just trying to understand the world around her. There are quite a lot of references to religion and the Bible in this book, and I think as such it will not be for everyone. It's actually part of the vlog that I did for the Rare Birds book club, which I will leave linked if you haven't seen that, and I talk about it in a bit more detail there, but I do think that that would be off-putting for some people. I don't think that you need to have a faith to read the book, and I don't think that the author particularly tries to sway the reader one way or the other between religion and science. I think that they present it in quite a impartial way. It is very much gifty story. It's almost like reading an autobiography in the way that it is delivered to us. I just think that some people won't enjoy that type of content. For me, it worked. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing Gifty's story and just going on a little bit of a coming of age experience and exploration with her. Loved it. Another book that I actually read and vlogged my reading experience of, which again I will leave linked in the description box, was The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This is a much hyped, much beloved book in the book community, and I was definitely nervous going in because it has a lot of my buzzwords, but I have been burnt before, so yeah, I was a little bit hesitant going in, but honestly I needn't have worried. So this is dark academia with fantasy / magical realism blended through. We have 6 magic wielders who are given the opportunity to compete to enter an elite society. Basically, the Library of Alexandria that we were led to believe had been destroyed actually hadn't, and once these magic wielders come into this secret society, they will have access to the learnings and the books of the Library of Alexandria, so the stakes are pretty high. I really enjoyed this book. It was dark, it was high stakes. I won't say that the characters were morally grey, they were just not good people. Some of them had a little bit of conflict over right and wrong, but for the most part they were just out for themselves. They were egotistical, they were arrogant, there was this sense of elitism, and that whatever choices they made, they were making them for themselves. I mean, the basic premise of this really is, what lengths would you be willing to go to access power and knowledge? And it's very much a character driven exploration of that. The reason that it lost a star and I only gave it 4 stars is very much a me thing, in that there is a lot of heavy scientific talk in this book. It looks at time continuums and time travel and black holes and lots of things that I don't really compute, and as such I sort of skim read those parts. It's just not something that I massively enjoy reading about. As I say, that's very much a me problem. If that's the type of thing you like reading about and you like all the other things that I've mentioned, then I think you would really enjoy this book. It didn't matter to me, I just sort of skim read over those parts and I could ignore them where necessary because I thought that the rest of the book really stood up in terms of its magic system and its characters. The fact that we read from each different character's point of view, and I felt that their voices were quite strong and didn't tend to blend together once I'd sort of got a feel for who everyone was. I thought it was a clever setup and a clever concept. I do have a lot of questions. I will be reading the next one. I'm intrigued to see how the story is going to develop. There were lots of twists and turns that I just didn't see coming. I think on the whole it was a really solid book. I'm very pleased that I picked it up, and I gave it 4 stars. The next book that I read was One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Taylor Jenkins Reid is an author that I absolutely adore, and I'm working my way slowly through her backlist. So this is contemporary romance, basically exploring the concept of how many true loves can an individual have. So we have our main character Emma, who marries her high school sweetheart Jessie, and on the eve, I think, of their first anniversary, Jessie goes missing in a helicopter over an ocean, and Emma is, as you might expect, completely devastated. Flash forward several years and Emma has slowly begun to put her life back together. She has a new career, she has new motivation, she has a new fiance, and just before she gets married, Jessie turns back up, throwing Emma's life into complete conflict. And it very much seeks to look at, is Emma the same person that she was when she was with Jessie? Have her circumstances changed who she was, and so they can't be together, and she's created this new life with this new love, and how that all sort of doesn't work and doesn't blend together, and Emma has to make some really difficult decisions. I really wanted to enjoy this book. I really like the idea, I like the premise and the concept of it. Unfortunately for me, it just didn't work, and I think that was largely because of the writing style. It very much was surface level. It was almost like an essay where Taylor Jenkins Reid presented a concept and then very lightly explored how that might look. I didn't feel any real depth or connection with the characters or the story, which meant that ultimately I didn't actually care very much what the outcome was. So much so that I flicked forward to the end to see what the outcome was, to see whether I was interested in carrying on with reading, which is really unusual for a Taylor Jenkins Reid book for me, because one of the things that I really like is her storytelling, and in her later books, Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones and the Six, Malibu Rising, it was the element of storytelling that I loved the most, but that was really missing and lacking in this book. Sadly, I just wasn't that invested in the characters, didn't think the story was told that well. Bit of a letdown. I will say, if you like quick contemporary reads, you like a little bit of high stakes because you don't really know what choice Emma's going to make and we're presented with various different opinions and views and outcomes, then you might enjoy this. But for me it was just okay, and I gave it 3 stars. Sorry if I've moved position, my camera battery died. So the next book was one that again I expected to love, but sadly I thought that the execution was a little bit lacking, and that was Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith. I read this as part of a buddy read. It's a classic mystery thriller about 2 strangers who meet on a train, and through conversation it comes out that both of them have a person in their lives that they would prefer were no longer a part of their lives. And so one of the strangers, Bruno, says that he has come up with the perfect crime, in that Bruno could kill the person in Greg's life and Greg could kill the person in Bruno's life, and because they are complete strangers meeting by chance, no one would ever work out what had gone on. And when Bruno takes it upon himself to kill the person in Greg's life, what we basically then follow is a descent into complete chaos and nightmare on the part of Greg as he tries to work out what on earth he is going to do next, and as Bruno begins to put pressure on him to fulfill his side of the bargain. I really wanted to like this book. I thought it was a really clever concept and I wanted to follow the exploration of it, and I just thought that it could have been so cleverly done. And there were definitely elements of it that I enjoyed. The chapters varied between being very short and sharp and thrillerish to being very long and meandering and confusing, and I understand why the author did that when Greg is grappling with his guilt and with his confusion over what to do, and he just gets more and more tangled up. That's the meandering side of things, but it just didn't work for me. I thought that it was too confusing, and basically I lost interest, whereas the chapters that were very sharp and to the point, I really flew through those and I really enjoyed that side of it, and I wish that she'd lent a little bit more into that rather than the whole meandering chaotic side of things. So sadly I only gave this 2.5 stars because I really just didn't care very much by the end. Expected to love it a lot more than I did. I'm quite pleased I read it because obviously it is a classic, and I now know that perhaps I wouldn't necessarily reach for this author again, but yeah, on the whole, not a very impressive read. Next, I picked up my book club's pick for January, and that was The Lamplighters by Emma Stonex. This is historical fiction about 3 men who go missing when they are working on a lighthouse. When the relief comes, they find that the door is barred, a meal is set up, the clocks have stopped, but all 3 of the men have mysteriously vanished. So we're following 2 timelines. We're following what happened in the lead up to the men disappearing, and then we're following 20 years later the wives and partners of these men when an author comes to these women and says that he wants to get to the bottom of what actually happened, and he's writing a story, and so he interviews each of these women, and we're so kind of following the fallout of what happened as well. I really liked this book. There was some division among the book club as to whether people enjoyed it or not. For me, it really worked. I liked the atmosphere, I liked the tension, I liked the mystery, I liked that we didn't ever really know what was going on, and every time we thought we had a theory, then it would be disproven, and so you were just constantly on the back foot over what was really going on. I liked the characters. I will say that the author does a great job of really capturing the isolation alongside the contrast of the forced proximity of these 3 men who are out on a lighthouse, and how that affects each of them individually. But it is also a little bit boring in places, and if you don't have any interest in the mundanity of the life of someone living on a lighthouse, then there are large parts of this book that you won't enjoy. it's quite a complex book in that the author tries to do an awful lot, and I don't know that they always get it 100% right. There's sort of a paranormal, ghostly element to it. There's a little bit of content where you're not really sure if what we're reading about are things that are actually happening, or if the men on the lighthouse are beginning to imagine it, especially as some of them are under quite a lot of pressure for various different things. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work. For me, I was happy just to sort of go along with it. I thought the writing was strong enough that I was intrigued and that I wanted to keep going, and I wanted to find out what was going to happen at the end. For other people, it didn't really work, and it ultimately let the story down. So yeah, a mixed one. Personally, thought it was really interesting. As I say, the writing was beautiful and really what kept me going. You know, I'm a sucker for strong writing in quiet stories. It doesn't bother me. If there's enough of a hook, which the mystery was for me, then I'm going to keep reading, and I gave it 4 stars. I think if you have been interested in reading this book, then I would definitely recommend it. I don't know how to describe it without it sounding really boring. Oh, we're reading about 3 men on a lighthouse is essentially what it is. But yeah, if you're interested, then look it up. As you can see, I tabbed some things. Thought it was a solid read. I gave it 4 stars. And the final book that I picked up this month was The Whalebone Theater by Joanna Quinn. This is the first of the 12 books which were recommended to me by people over on Instagram. As you can see, I borrowed it from the library. So this is historical fiction. It's a family story following the 3 Seagrave children from their unstructured and unusual childhood in the 1920s through to when they are young adults at the outbreak of the Second World War. So our 3 characters are Christabel, Flossie and Digby. Although we're predominantly following Christabel, we do get the stories of Digby and Flossie alongside. This is essentially a Second World War historical fiction story. I think the author wanted to examine the existence of the spy networks in the Second World War, predominantly the role of women within these networks, and that is very much where the story really takes off. But we do get the children's early childhood as well, so it does span quite a lot of decades. But I would say the story only really gains traction when we get into the meat of the Second World War, and when that story begins, then we really see these 3 individuals come into their own. And as I say, the story really picks up. I would describe it as quite meandering and slow up to that point. It was interesting, and it was interesting sort of getting to know these characters and seeing how their childhoods shaped who they believed they were going to be, and then how the war turned all of that upside down on its head, particularly Krista, who is the eldest and is actually an orphan. I'm not going to go into the really complex mother, stepfather. They're sort of siblings, sort of cousins, sort of all related in some way, but Krista is the oldest and she is very much struggling to find her place in the world. She never felt like she fit in. The war gives her the opportunity to do that, and then it's sort of like, well, what will she do afterwards and all that sort of thing. That's all really interesting, and that is really when the story begins to pick up. If you're happy with like a meandering look at their experiences through the decades in the build-up to the main event, then I think that you would enjoy it. Where the Whalebone Theater comes in is that Krista wants to be a director. So the family, when they are children, start putting on these plays, and that is a theme throughout the whole of the book as well. So I really enjoyed it. I like historical fiction, I like World War II historical fiction, and I liked enough of the story and the characters that I was interested in just plodding along and seeing what the author was going to tell us. It is another book that I would say probably is not for everybody. If you're the type of person who DNFs a book, I don't know that there would be enough to keep you reading before you got to the interesting part of the book. You just sort of have to stick with it. But for me, it worked overall. I gave it 4 stars. I'm really pleased that I was recommended it. I'm really glad. I would definitely look out for more work by this author, and I will also probably try and pick myself up a copy, because it may even be a book that I would come back to and reread. I'm not sure. But yes, I gave it 4 stars. I personally would recommend it if you like historical fiction. just be aware of what I've said, that it's a little bit meandering, a little bit slow, a little bit quiet, very much about discovering who our characters are, and then in the latter half of the book things really get going. So there you go, they are all the books that I read in the month of January. As I said, I had a pretty good reading month. Not only did I read quite a lot, but I also read a lot of books that I really enjoyed. So here's hoping that February is exactly the same. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Do let me know your favourite read in January. I always love to get more recommendations from you. Hope you're all keeping safe and well. Take care, and I'll see you soon.